IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Greetings to all our listeners. Welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution here in Bengaluru, India. I'm Anushka Saxena, your host for this episode and a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program at Takshashila. And today, I have the distinct privilege of interviewing Professor Kerry Brown for views and insights on the nature and priorities of contemporary Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping and US-China relations. Professor Brown is joining us today from London, where he is currently a distinguished professor of Chinese studies and director of the Lau China Institute at the esteemed King's College. I am sure that we are all well aware of his illustrious and highly acclaimed work on China studies in general and on understanding Xi Jinping and the CPC elite politics in specific. His various books are a delight to read, and I am personally really looking forward to reading his upcoming book by Taiwan Matters, which is, I believe, slated to be published in September this year. I'm honored to host you, Professor, and I warmly welcome you once again to the episode.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's good to speak to you.
Thank you. So in many of our previous podcast episodes on all things policy, we've discussed elements of China's foreign policy. We've discussed issues ranging from the impact of tech-related sanctions on US-China relations to the military-civilian nature of Chinese naval vessels operating in the Philippine and Indian exclusive economic zones. And today, our hope is to conduct a much deeper dive while also taking into account the broader picture vis-a-vis factors shaping Chinese foreign policy and its manifestations on various issues through the lens of an expert such as yourself, Professor Brown. So, Professor, if I may come to it without further ado, my first question to you would be, how can we describe the nature of Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping today? We often get to hear words such as the foreign policy being aggressive, expansionist, reckless, and arm twisting. And so in your opinion, what is the big picture behind some of these assessments, if they are indeed true? As in, what are the factors, both domestic and external, that have led to the adoption of an aggressive or even a lenient posture in this foreign policy dynamic? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Well, I think that, like the foreign policy of every country, China's foreign policy is dictated by its capacity, and its capacity today is much larger than it's ever been before. It's got the world's second biggest economy. It's got the ability to have acquired now the world's largest navy in terms of its vessel numbers, not in terms of its technology. So, the fact that China is now kind of wealthier than ever before means that it's going to have a bigger ability to do things. That's just a kind of fundamental sort of characteristic, not just for China, but for everyone. I think the second thing is it's changed its historical paradigm. So I think in the past, China tended to have a lower profile than it deserved. And now it's got this huge profile, which I'm not saying it doesn't deserve it, but it seems to be a place that's on everyone's mind. And I think that there's not kind of really ever been a happy medium with the outside world and kind of understanding, what kind of power China is. It seems to me that in the past, China was criticized in the period of Hu Jintao, the predecessor to the current leader, Xi Jinping, for not saying enough and being a bit silent about its intentions, and that made people suspicious. And now, because it probably says quite a lot about its view of the world, the Belt and Road Initiative and things like this makes people very, very nervous. So, I don't think really, no matter what China says, it's ever going to get an easy ride. Unless it just says we agree with everything the West says, well, then everyone will kind of suddenly become suspicious and think that it's just feigning agreement. I think it's not strange that China now has a more kind of high-profile position. It's really not strange. It's not strange that it should want more strategic space around it. I mean, it's really a question now of how we negotiate and how we settle for something that the majority will be happy with. But there's nothing that's strange about the situation that we're in now.
Right. That's quite an interesting take, Professor, because from my understanding of the analysis and the policy sentiment in India, China has become more aggressive than ever before, and it's changed from the lens that it really both encourages and coaxes our hand into keeping our guard always up, and that's had some obvious implications for at least for Chinese neighbors. But I absolutely agree with the point that it is um, always on our minds, and that may not necessarily be a bad thing, or maybe something that China doesn't deserve. And so, from the domestic politics perspective, uh, some of the analysis also seems to indicate that she seems to have become this all powerful individual with near complete control over foreign policy dynamics. And so, in your opinion, is this true? And if not, what are some of the, say, competing views or logics that Xi Jinping or the entire foreign policy apparatus is perhaps faced with in their articulation of China's foreign policy goals, and where are they coming from? Just as an example, are Chinese businesses in particular opposed to deteriorating relations with the US, or is it really true that everyone has to adjust with the kind of foreign policy layout that has been put forth by, say, Xi Jinping?
Well, on the final point about business people and what their view is, I think it's pretty clear that they would like good access to the American market, and they would like to have good access to American capital. I mean, they're business people. I mean, there would be it'd be a strange world if they didn't want that ability. I mean, I think the point about the all-powerful leader is, I mean, what I find interesting is how much we all love fairy tales. We all love stories, right? And the all-powerful leader is one of the most long-standing myths, right? Because I don't think there's ever been any such thing. I mean, maybe thousands of years ago, or like hundreds of years ago, there were people that could control, most of the kind of state apparatus, but then states then were quite small. Today, Xi Jinping sits at the center of what must be the most complex state architecture on the planet. I mean, there's 5 levels of governance. I mean, there's 31 plus, kind of provinces and autonomous regions. I mean, it's a country that's the size of a continent. I mean, all powerful in the sense of what? I mean, I guess he's all powerful because the propagandists have put his image in so many places. He's all powerful because the outside world seems totally obsessed by him, particularly politicians, particularly in Europe and America. He's all powerful in the sense that, his ideology has his name, and people obviously written a lot about that. But all powerful, I think, means therefore he's kind of present in a lot of places, but there's clearly all sorts of things in which he doesn't really have the ability to sway or push things the way that, can presumably an omnipotent power would want to do. He certainly doesn't seem to be all powerful over the economy at the moment, because that's struggling. He's obviously not been all powerful over appointments recently, because the foreign minister and defense minister last year both went. I mean, they may have been his appointments, but he couldn't keep them in power. He doesn't seem to be in power of the kind of organization of the party, because there's still obviously lots of corruption or other issues. I mean, he doesn't seem to be in power, completely in power in the last Congress, where Hu Jintao, for some reason, disappeared from the stage, either for benign or non-benign reasons. However, I think that China needs this image of someone who looks like they're in control. The scary thing is if, there isn't that level of control at the center, or the appearance of it. I mean, power is a mirage. It's sort of what people see. It's not really what is. It's sort of like a sort of misty thing that, who kind of doesn't really have any tangibility. I think that Xi Jinping has been a good magician. He's created this image of power. But I mean, I'm worried at the moment that there's significant things where we should be concerned. In particular, the lack of a successor. I mean, this is a system that is extremely vulnerable to leadership struggles. And Mao Zedong's death in 1976, there were, kind of several years of struggle. On the whole, the Communist Party has managed to have succession happen in different ways. There's never been a real set pattern. The Xi Jinping kind of leadership seems to be currently bereft of a clear plan for when he's not there. And the day when he's not there might happen, in a long time, or it might happen soon, but he's not going to be there forever. I mean, he's a human being, right? So I think that's what I worry about. And the all-powerful leader at the moment seems incapable of actually sorting this issue out. And I wonder whether he actually isn't capable of sorting it out, because it is insoluble. It will just have to happen somehow with legitimacy confirmed on someone else. This is a show of his real limits. We shouldn't always be looking at an extension of Xi Jinping's powers. We should be looking at the limits of them. That's where we understand things. And I think there's been a lack of that in recent years as we get so kind of obsessed by how powerful we think he is.
That's brilliant, Professor. That makes a lot of sense. A magician, but with human limitations. I think that's exactly how we should look at Xi Jinping.
Magicians are tricksters. Remember, magicians are tricksters. So, once you know the trick, you don't think they're magicians anymore. So we got to remember that.
Absolutely, which is also the reason why China is in the black box, because once we slowly learn to understand the tricks, we also understand the game of the shadows. If I may just quickly ask a follow-up question on the question of corruption. Since you took examples of the former foreign minister and defense minister, and they were supposed to be quite close to Xi Jinping. They were supposed to be their aides, their Xi Jinping's personally favored appointments. And so do you see a hint of a factional struggle in perhaps the decision behind their posts being revoked, in addition to, of course, the corruption scandals and the relevant investigations that were behind them all?
I don't really see a factional struggle. I think that Xi Jinping has been effective in getting rid of factions, and there is no faction now. There's just Xi's people who've been appointed under his quite long period in power. I think the two cases you're referring to were different. That's why it's confusing. They happened sort of around the same time. Qin Gang was quite young. I actually knew him when he was a serving diplomat in London. And kind of obviously very good at dealing with the foreign media. It seems like, reports have just appeared of, the possibility that his claimed lover, who had a child in America, a journalist called Fu Xiaotian, who was also based in London in the early 2010s, and who interviewed me a couple of times. It seems that she's been linked with British intelligence. I don't know anything about these claims, but that kind of made his position extremely difficult. And there's even claims that he tried to, commit suicide. It's extremely complicated. This case does not seem to be straightforward. So I think we can't really make any conclusions about that at all. About the defense minister, Li Shangfu, I think there seems to be kind of much more evidence of this being really about corruption, about his inability to rein in corruption in the parts of the People's Liberation Army. So, both of these cases are kind of, well, you can understand why these people were in trouble. I don't think that you can really make a big connection between them. It's not unusual. In Western systems, ministers are appointed, and then pretty soon, almost kind of with great regularity, they have to resign for one reason or another. In the Chinese system, it's odd that there is so much stability. If you think under Xi Jinping at the top level, in the Politburo, in the last 10 years, it's been mostly stability. People have come and gone at the time they were expected to come and go. So that's the kind of odd thing. It's not that there has been these two cases. That's interesting. It's strange that there's been so much stability. That's the thing that I find weird.
Right, Professor. That definitely makes a lot of sense. And of course, would you then also argue, just to quickly ping back on what you said about stability being the real interesting thing in this dynamic, do you think this stability in the past couple of years is also a result of, say, Xi Jinping's rather vehement emphasis on anti-graft and anti-corruption?
Well, I think that anti-corruption makes political sense, and it makes sense for Xi Jinping. I mean, it's a great way of doing several things. So why would a politician not avail himself of that? And I think Xi Jinping is has been an effective politician. So to have used the corruption campaign originally to get more support from the public, because the public, like everywhere, don't like politicians and they like seeing them, done in. Also, it did deal with, the enormous wastage in the system up to a point. And it was useful for Xi because it meant that people who were irritating him, he could basically, this could be a use for that. So I think it's not a straightforward kind of campaign. Today, however, there's issues about Xi Jinping's political ability now. I mean, I think as someone's followed him for, 12 years, I mean, I think he's an effective Chinese politician. And when you say effective Chinese politician in the West these days, because there's so many people that have narratives in their head that will not shift no matter what you say. You can explain that in saying he's an effective Chinese politician, it's not saying he's good or bad. He's just obviously effective. Like, you might not like tennis, but someone who plays it well or not well, right? I think he was an effective politician. That is not a validation. It's not saying he's a good person or anything, or it's good what he's doing. He's effective in his system. He's been extremely effective. And I can see signs now of maybe that not being the case. There's issues about, he's having a plan for the economy. There's issues about how, he seems to be managing the kind of whole system that he's at the center of. And fundamentally an issue of, can he delegate? Now, everyone says that he's the Mao Zedong of China. Mao Zedong was a terrible delegator. That's why his politics couldn't really be sustainable. His successor, Deng Xiaoping, was a good delegator on the whole, though he had problems sometimes, but he delegated well. Xi Jinping really, it's not quite clear if he's a good delegator, but he needs to be now because the sort of complexity of the problems China's facing clearly cannot be dealt with by one man giving executive orders left, right, and center. So that's what I'm really looking at the moment. There's signs that other people are having a bigger presence, and you can see a joint and combined leadership rather than someone just basically controlling everything and not probably doing it very well.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Thank you for that, Professor. And if I may move on to another issue that's really been of significance in the debate on China and Chinese policy making, is the tense US-China relationship. It's become quite volatile, and a bunch of factors from the Taiwan issue to the competitive nature of technology geopolitics are sort of contributing to this. And so, in your understanding of the developments from these past few years, what are some of the, say, fundamental differences or fault lines that are underpinning the US-China dynamic? And are any of these maybe not resolvable, but are any of these addressable through meaningful communication, or as the US like to put it, or those in the US like to put it, guardrailing?
Well, I think that the US policy has been in the last few years understandable, but I mean, as ever, when the United States is not alone in this, I think we're all in this, at least in Europe and America. We're 10 years too late. We're 10 years too late. We kind of don't, I think in our policy, we tend to neglect looking at the ones that are closest to China. I think if you want the perfect Chinese policy, you would combine the Indian and the Japanese policy. You would. What I admire about the Indian policy is that you have, obviously the ability to, on the surface, sort of, have like this great friendly kind of, relationship with China. Underneath, obviously, there's massive, massive differences, and the fact that the border issue is not resolved and probably never will be resolved in the current situation is a sign that there's obviously a lot of suspicion and mistrust. And I think that's understandable. The same with Japan. Japan is deeply skeptical of Chinese power. And I think the West is usually going through periods of deep sort of antagonism and then periods of embracing and getting very idealistic. We swing backwards and forwards. And we never kind of really hit the middle where we basically think, okay, we just want to do deals that work for us. We know what we want. And I think the other parts of Trump's politics, I won't say anything about. But the part about China, I think, in some respects, was not a dumb policy. Just basically focus on transaction and, leave everything else out of it. Don't get obsessed by values and things. These are too complicated. Just talk about, why are we getting a raw deal from you? Because you have got a lot from us and we're not getting anything back. And I think that's a sensible policy. The problem is that most of the things that China has needed from the West, it's now kind of got. And so we've lost our leverage. So I think, these kind of trade wars and everything have ended up being as much about what the West loses as what China loses. Going forward, I think it's going to be tough. Now there's, obviously an American position on China, which is largely antagonistic. I mean, I'm sure were I an academic in America, I would have a tough time because I'm, kind of maybe regarded as being, in trying to be neutral, which is what I do try and be, you every day get people saying that you're defending China because they don't seem to understand that explaining isn't defending. I mean, they obviously have a problem with English rather than Chinese politics because those words are very, very different. So I think that it's very difficult to try and create a sensible policy when your fundamental understanding of the situation is not that accurate. I mean, I don't think with China we're dealing with a new United States who wants a pax sinica, like a kind of world dominated by China. I think it's that we got a power we're facing that wants bespoke kind of ad hoc responsibility. It'll get involved when it has to, but it doesn't really want to get involved in security issues. Its security proposals in the last couple of years have been very broad about Russia and Ukraine. They were very, very, they weren't particularly detailed about the Middle East. Again, they've really not been things that you could really implement. I think that China is in this position where it really doesn't want to get involved. However, it kind of has to for its self-interest. And I think it's also still aware that it's dealing with America, which is nervous and kind of interprets everything it does, usually in the most negative way. So, I mean, there's many things that China has not done well. There's many things that China has done badly. But I think its situation is, it's understandable why, its situation is a tough one. And I think, kind of having these hardline policies about we just kind of chuck China out of our universities, chuck China out of everything we can, call China our biggest economic threat, and yet carry on, still trying to do business with it is a little bit weird. It's not very coherent and consistent. And I think that that's our problem. That's not China's problem. That's our problem.
Right. That definitely makes a lot of sense, Professor. I think both America's, or rather, the Trump foreign policy response of most relationships being transactional, and not just with China, but also with the security promises Trump has perhaps made to, say, Japan and Southeast Asia. This element kind of figures, and at the same time, even China's difficult position and its policy approach is understandable. But one thing that you said at the very start of this response, which was I think interesting to me, was that you said we're all in this, and Europe is also trying to navigate the China question, so to say. And so, what, if I may ask, what sense do you get from Europe's policy professor on China? How coherent is the how coherent do, say, European policymakers believe the US's policy of sanctions or keeping China out of a bunch of things is? And is EU sort of following that path or not?
Well, I mean, Europe is a mess. I mean, it's a mess, but then it's been a mess forever. So that's not unusual. I mean, it's at the moment, there's sort of all sorts of factors about China which are creating a China mess, a European China mess. One is, obviously the relationship between US and China. It's very complicated, and Europe is stuck in the middle, and Europe hates being stuck in the middle. Secondly, it's because Germany is the heart of, the trade relationship. It's the only European country that had a trade surplus with China because of manufacturing things like cars. And now with BYD and companies like that in China, they're really exporting huge amounts, and Germany's kind of lost its role. So this has caused a huge problem. The third is Europe is beset by, economic issues, and China figures in that sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. Everyone's still trying to sort of extract benefit from China because of their economic woes. The Europeans don't really seem to have found a way of getting the balance between their domestic, kind of issues and the fact that many people are wary of China, and the fact that they definitely need certain things. Europe has, like America, climate change, or global warming, relationship with China on the environment. That sort of stuff is happening relatively constructively. It's doing all sorts of other dialogues on technical issues. The European Union is a technocratic institution in a way. And so on that level, it's able to continue quite a lot of dialogue with China. But in terms of whether there is a coherent European policy on China, I don't think there is, and I don't think there could be. I think in the past there was, because the European view on the whole was, we want to help China become more like us, like democratize and have a legal system like us. And now, of course, that doesn't seem to be likely to happen. And so there's no kind of consensus on what the target should be. Some people just want to do business. Some people still want to really hammer China for human rights. You will always find, as in America, that once you mention issues like Xinjiang, sensitive issues, even though, which I have many, many times, I've said this is, a gross violation of human rights. It's not, the Chinese government have not done the right thing. But, like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty, I haven't used the genocide word. I tell you, if you explain that until you're nearly kind of, dying from explaining it, you will get zealous lobby groups who will shriek at you and say, you are, kind of defending genocide. No, I'm not. I just don't think that in this situation that word is particularly helpful. And so, we get hung up a lot of the time in Europe on our battles with ourselves, because, this is really a battle within ourselves, where, kind of the diversity of views can kind of fold in on itself, whereas we're not really addressing the issue of what do we really think we're dealing with China and its economic and, its security sort of posture. What sort of challenge is that? And there, I don't think Europe really has it's kind of got a more hardline view now than it had in the past. But then there's a question of what it can do about it. So I think it's a bit of a mess at the moment. European Union policy is a bit of a mess. And that's reflected in the UK. The UK, its policy at the moment is incoherent. Completely incoherent. It doesn't have a policy. An incoherent policy, therefore, is not a policy. It's sort of, China is our greatest economic threat. However, we need to do more business with China. That's about kind of, that makes no sense. British foreign policy has been extremely unrealistic in the last few years and poorly managed. The exiting of the EU, to no one's surprise, really, was not possibly, it wasn't possible to do it well. It was done for reasons beyond economic well-being and other, things. And it's ended up basically disappointing everyone. So it's not surprising on that issue where, we thought way more deeply, and we still made such a huge strategic mistake that on China, we don't really kind of know what it is we're after or what we're doing. We just have a vague idea, and vague ideas when you're dealing with China don't really help.
Right. That's actually really hit home with me, Professor, because we're dealing with a similar kind of a question and a dilemma in India where, we have these vague ideas about how to address China as an economic challenge. We sort of attach a production linked incentive scheme with everything from towels to EV manufacturing. But at the same time, we also realize that to really achieve that dream of being one of the world's biggest exporters, the manufacturing hub of the world, so on and so forth, we need to continue to do business with China, or else we lose significant advantages vis-a-vis raw materials, consumer welfare, and so on. So I think governments are really, really struggling with that question. If I can also ask you about the EU's understanding of China's policy on the Russia-Ukraine war, do you think there are still the kind of concerns that there perhaps were initially, that China isn't doing enough on Ukraine, or has the Russia-Ukraine war issue really become something that's going alongside other regular things, and the EU doesn't really care if China isn't a bit more vocal on it, or isn't really doing to mediate, to foster peace, so on and so forth. So is there still an onus of responsibility on China in the perception of the EU, or has it really receded to the background because it's been so long?
Well, I think on Russia, Ukraine, I mean, just sort of obviously the perspectives are fundamentally different. And I think there's not much understanding that for China to get kind of involved in a NATO-led support for Russia, for Ukraine against Russia, I mean, China is not in the business of supporting the Western imperium. It's out of that game, right? And that's, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's just the way it is. And its history kind of explains that. It's been done over by the West too often. There's no, kind of desire to continue this, sort of monopoly for the future. So, but that doesn't mean that China is particularly happy with what Russia's done. I mean, I think it's complicated. There's ways in which it's probably sympathetic, and there's ways in which it just thinks, this is not really anything that it wants to get involved with, except just to kind of keep, on the fence. And I think for Europe, it's interesting if China had got more deeply involved, even in kind of helping Ukraine. I don't know what that would mean, really. I mean, we want China to just agree with us. That's what we want. I don't see we'd be in a situation where we'd be at all happy if China were to deploy People's Liberation Army troops anywhere. If it actually did things beyond peacekeeping forces and things like that, we kind of, that's not what we want. We want China just to basically support us, vote the right way at the UN and stuff like that. And, obviously increasingly it doesn't do that. So I think, these things, the Russia-Ukraine situation, the Middle East, these have all been test cases. And on the whole, China has, as far as it can, shown that it just doesn't want to get too deeply involved. And I think for Europeans, that is something we should think about. I mean, it's not obvious. A China that waded in and started to really kind of get deeply involved would be confirmation that we are therefore dealing with an aggressive usurper of US interests, right? And that's what lots of people expected. But a China that doesn't want to get involved is also kind of something we have to think through, because this means that the world's second biggest economy is going to largely just sit it out. It might get involved with rebuilding and redoing stuff. It might well deal with things via proxies. I mean, it might be behind, a lot of the things that Iran is doing at the moment. All of this is possible, but you can't kind of really, take China to a court of judgment and say, right, you're guilty. We've got you. We know what you're up to. It's more complicated. I think that China is likely at the moment to want predictability in the international environment. It's dealing with a lot of internal issues that are tough, and it's unlikely to want something that's going to really flare up. So I don't think it's going to kind of be very keen on any more instability. I'm dubious about the idea it's using proxies. I mean, I think kind of Blinken or Jake Sullivan in the United States raised these issues with Wang Yi about, was China involved in the Iranian, kind of issues. And I believe that they also thought that China would be able to use pressure and put pressure on Iran. Maybe that's a future position that China can have. It's literally able to talk to everyone in a weird way. Everyone kind of will talk to it because they kind of hope that it might actually be useful to them. That might be a future role for it, not the one that's got at the moment, but in the future. At the moment, I don't think it's willing to be very active, but it's also aware of its self-interest, so it does do some stuff. That's quite a frustrating situation for everyone, but I think that's where we are at the moment.
Right. That again makes a lot of sense, Professor. And I think speaking of China's self-interests and where it and where we all perceive it is potentially really very active, brings me to the issue of Taiwan. And Professor, this will be my last question to you. Your upcoming book, Why Taiwan Matters, which I alluded to earlier, it's piqued great interest with me, with the Takshashila community, and with many of my other colleagues in the China studies circles in India. And if I may, could you, in brief, really answer this question for our listeners, both for China and globally? Why does Taiwan matter?
Right. Well, I think it matters because it is the likeliest conflict that could become a global conflict with great and destructive consequences. The fact that China insists that Taiwan is part of China's territory, the fact that Taiwan is a democracy with a very different kind of outlook now and has been de facto independent since the 1940s, all of these are a perfect kind of combination to create enormous conflict and tension. Two very, very incompatible demands in an extremely sensitive area where Taiwan produces 90% of the world's high-tech semiconductors that we're all reliant on, which America is a kind of soft ally. This is not going to go well if it gets out of hand. And the fact that, well, even if you look at any scenario, this is what I've obviously been thinking about in writing this book, you look at any scenario apart from the current one of management, well, everything is a mess. Kind of China that militarily moves on Taiwan will create, chaos, but also it'll deal with a Taiwan that's got 23 million people who just don't have the same values, in terms of politics, in terms of, their mind, their world view is as Taiwanese, really. So this is not something that we could come up with a nice, neat solution. One of the things about this issue is that for, Europeans and North Americans and probably most people, we like solutions. We like, kind of neatness. We're all very neat. Our thinking is very neat. We're taught, at school to be very neat and compartmentalize things. At universities, we live in this fictive world where, we have discipline areas. And of course, everything is actually a mixture. With this issue, there's no neatness. This today is where we need to stay. Right? We don't want to go tomorrow where we're going to solve things and then the whole thing blows up. And I think there's people around at the moment who are sort of peddling this idea that, oh yeah, we have a solution. We just basically recognize Taiwan and everything's good. No, that will not create, that won't help. That will definitely not help. So that's what we've got to remember. The Taiwan-China situation is a situation that must be kept as it is because there is no solution. And there might be a solution one day, but not at the moment and not for the long foreseeable future.
Right. Really brilliant, Professor. I think most of the issues with China studies in specific or with geopolitics would really be much easier handled if we, as you put it, stay in today and in the moment. So thank you so much for leaving our listeners with that. With that, once again, Professor, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you for your time and your wonderful insights today on a very fascinating subject. As we conclude, I would again like to encourage our listeners to pick up Professor Brown's brilliant books on Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, and other aspects of Chinese history and domestic and foreign policies. And please do also keep an eye out for Why Taiwan Matters. Thank you once again, Professor Brown, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you very much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.